My name's David Seljak, and I am director of the St. Jerome Center. And I would like to welcome you all, and especially our guest, Karen Armstrong, to St. Jerome's this evening. I'd like to start the evening by thanking two people who were key in bringing Ms. Armstrong to St. Jerome's. The first is Chuck Arian of Wordsworth Book. Thank you for your efforts, Chuck. And the second is Sheila Kay of Random House, whom I actually know from, well, more than 5 years ago when we were undergraduates at the University of Toronto. So it's great to see you again here. As you know, Karen Armstrong writes great books and great books on God. I, on the other hand, am a scholar of religion. And there's a difference between the two, and it's not just the difference between those who can't teach. A scholar is someone who finds themselves walking along a heavenly path and comes upon a fork in the road, and there are two signs. One says to heaven, the other says to a seminar on heaven. And a scholar never takes the first one. On her trip to Canada, I hope Karen Armstrong will find just how seriously Canadians take their religion. As Preston Manning, the former leader of the Canadian Conservative Alliance Party, said when he visited us here at the St. Jerome Center last fall, that Canada is one place where even after we adjust for inflation, the wages of sin is still death. Anyway, my job is simply to welcome you here and to introduce Chuck Arian of Wordsworth Book, who has the pleasure of introducing our speaker tonight. So please help me welcome Chuck Arian.
Thank you. This is indeed a privilege. Wordsworth sponsors many author events, but very few of the caliber of Karen Armstrong. We're really excited to be part of this tonight. Karen Armstrong has started her life with 7 years in a Catholic convent. You probably know that if you know anything about her. She left the order in the late 60s, studied English literature at Oxford, and then became a teacher, and then, well, all of this is in the book, so I'm not going to tell you all of that. But the way I want to introduce her is by explaining that her arrival here today is really the culmination of a series of failures. And I mean that seriously. It starts off with the breakdown in the convent. The fact that she left the convent meant that if she hadn't left the convent, she wouldn't have discovered her academic skills, her research and intelligence and book writing abilities. If she hadn't failed her doctorate, or she was failed by her committee, I don't think she failed her doctorate, but if the committee hadn't failed her, she wouldn't have discovered her teaching skills. If she, a little later, hadn't finally been diagnosed with epilepsy, she might not have left teaching. If she hadn't written The Narrow Gate, to talk about those early years in the convent, she might not have been discovered for TV in Britain. If she hadn't been discovered for TV, she wouldn't have written her book on the Crusades and gained the insights into Islam. And from there, the body of work that we're all familiar with. That body of work is not the work of an academic theologian. It's the work of someone who has deep insight into what I call the interstices between religions, the things that religions have in common, and the humanities that she's been able to share between religions. Her books have been translated into 40 languages. She's the author of 3 television documentaries, as well as Bill Moyer's television series on Genesis. In 1999, she was awarded the Muslim Public Affairs Council Media Award, and since September 11th, 2001, she's been a frequent contributor to conferences, panels, newspapers, and periodicals on both sides of the Atlantic on the subject of Islam and fundamentalism. Karen Armstrong makes her home in London, but we are very glad that she's made the journey here to Waterloo. Please help me welcome Karen Armstrong.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure and an honor to be here tonight. I was interested that you picked out this theme of failure, because until I was nearly 50, my life seemed a complete failure. Everything I turned my hand to turned to dust and ashes. And starting off, in fact, in the convent, I went in to become a nun at the ludicrously young age of 17. Against my parents' wishes, they quite rightly thought that I was far too young to make this kind of momentous decision. But I was determined to do it, and as I had been always rather a biddable child up until then, they thought it was better for me to get this out of my system. Otherwise, they thought I might have been spending my entire university days in a state of mulish obstinacy, longing to do what I really wanted to do. So on the 14th of September 1962, I packed my bags and set off to find God, because that's what I wanted to do. I hadn't enjoyed being a child and an adolescent in the 1950s. I looked stupid in the clothes, and it was a difficult period to grow up in Britain after the war. We may have won the war, in inverted commas, but in fact we had been relegated at the end of it to the status of a second-rate power, and were in debt to the United States for £3 billion. There was rationing. All our cities were in rubble, and and my hometown, Birmingham, remained in rubble throughout my entire childhood, and was not rebuilt until the time I was in the convent. I grew up in a sort of ground zero environment, and it was very hard to see how you could mate this vision of lots of stirring talk about our finest hour in the war, and not much talk about what on earth we were supposed to do now. And the role of women had been reduced. All the women that I could see seemed to spend their time cooking, cleaning, washing, and toiling and ironing, chores I detest to this day. By contrast, the nuns seemed remarkably unencumbered, as I thought. And I wanted this kind of radical freedom. And above all, I wanted to get beyond my adolescent confusion and become transfigured and transformed by an encounter with the divine, with God. I could see myself becoming Buddha-like and inspired and inspiring, luminous, wise, serene, and even a saint. I could see myself, I was embarked on it in a spirit of great adventure. And yet I left 7 years after that, in 1969, somehow obscurely broken and damaged. And this was nobody's fault. For a start, I'd been far too young to attempt this kind of life anyway. It wasn't right for me. And I also encountered the religious life at its worst. I was one of the last people to go through the old system of training before that system was reformed by the decrees of the Second Vatican Council. And almost as if to ward off unwelcome change that was seen to be impending, and it seemed to be inevitable, the order had appointed a particularly conservative novice mistress who revived many of the arcane practices that her two predecessors had in fact laid aside. And being trained as a nun in those days, I'm sure it's all very different now, was not like going to be trained to be a nurse or a teacher, to be given a skill so that left your deepest personal self untouched. It was a conditioning. It was a total way of life that was meant to change you and irrevocably. And it did change me irrevocably. So that when I came out of the convent 7 years later, having imbued this, being imbued with this practice, I found it almost impossible to live in the world without, because I'd been taught to reject this world at a very profound level. We'd not heard, I entered in 1962, shortly before the massive social change of the 1960s. I knew nothing of what was going on outside. Shortly after I entered, we had the Cuba Missile Crisis. And we were told about this. This was a special concession because the world seemed about to end in a nuclear holocaust. Those of you who were alive at that time will remember this. But unfortunately, our superiors forgot to tell us postulants that the crisis had been resolved. And we went on. We weren't supposed to ask for news of the world, and we went on scanning the horizon for mushroom clouds for 3 weeks until one of us had the gall and courage to ask at recreation, and then our superior found it terribly funny that they'd forgotten to tell us. We were also told about the death of President Kennedy, the Catholic president. But otherwise, I'd never, when I left the convent in 1969, I had scarcely heard of the Beatles. And I had never heard of Vietnam. I knew none of the prime ministers in power. But more than that, I was, in a sense, programmed to reject the world. And now I had to mate with it, in a sense, and I couldn't do it. I did not know how to live. I became anorexic, suicidal, and not because I wanted to die, but simply because I didn't know how to live, and didn't feel that I had a future. One of the great problems that I'd had in the convent was that I was completely unable to pray. Now, you can see, some of you are laughing already, that this was a real drawback for a nun. And now it's a laughing matter, but this was a matter of such searing shame to me. Every morning we would go into the chapel at 6 o'clock and kneel for an hour's meditation. Now, I have since had no problem at all concentrating. You can put me in front of a pile of books and time passes and I don't even notice the time passing. But as soon as I knelt down, my mind in the convent to begin my meditation, my mind went off at a tangent. And everybody else seemed to be getting on all right with prayer. I would say to my superiors that I couldn't pray, that I'd never experienced what the textbooks used to tell us were spiritual consolation. And they said, rubbish, sister, we all have off days. And I used to think to myself, no, I would love to have off days, because then it would mean that some of my days were on. But this inability to pray was a corrosive and pain at the center of my religious life, because a nun's commitment is it depends entirely upon the intensity of her prayer. And my prayer life was a huge zero. I longed for God, and yet either God, if he existed, had no interest in me, or I was allergic to him. When I left the convent, I had an added difficulty in that I had an undiagnosed illness. In the convent, I had experienced, from the time I was about 18, occasional fainting fits. And this was in my, both in my school days with this order, and I was told fainting was something that was simply weakness of will, hysteria. And I was told simply to pull myself together. And I had imbibed this ethos. Everything in those days was supposed to be psychosomatic. And then after I left the religious life, I started to be prey to paralyzing bouts of fear and terror. It would come upon me if I were tired. At Oxford, where I had been sent to the university, we had the ridiculous practice, I now think, we had to write an essay, a major piece of work every week, and we all spent the night before up all night writing it. And the day after, I would often be absolutely overcome with terror, a complete dread. I'd almost feel somebody standing next to me. I'd almost see him, though not quite. Sometimes I'd be outside in shopping or something and would be unable to recognize my surroundings. Suddenly the whole world became unfamiliar. Or I'd start out to go to one place and end up somewhere completely different. And of course I thought I was losing my mind. I thought that perhaps I'd been so damaged by the experience or that I was completely unable to adjust to the world. I could not live in the world outside. Eventually, this was diagnosed. I went to psychiatrists, and I talked to them for hours about my extremely normal and unexciting and much-loved childhood. But eventually, 7 years later, it was discovered that I had epilepsy. I have epilepsy of the temporal lobe, and these symptoms are absolutely classic. And all I needed was some medication to correct this imbalance in the brain. I have a scar across the temporal lobe of the brain as a result of a birth injury. Now, this also impeded my progress because if you don't feel that your mind has any integrity, then it's very difficult to believe that you have a future. It's very difficult also to make relationships. I believe Freud once said, if you if you have toothache, you cannot fall in love, and you certainly cannot take part in psychoanalysis. And I had a neurological equivalent of toothache. And the day that I was diagnosed as an epileptic was the happiest day of my life, I think. I can see that for many people, the diagnosis of epilepsy would be a terrible setback. But for me, it was such a relief to know that now I had a future, that I wasn't going mad. I had envisaged myself ending my days in a locked ward. Now I could begin to live. But then, as it was pointed out, everything I turned my hand to also failed. You heard I failed my doctorate. I had longed to be a university teacher. I wanted to teach English literature in a university, but I failed my PhD. And I didn't even fail decently. I failed in a blare of publicity, because there was a scandal about the failure. It was thought that the thesis hadn't been properly examined, and for 5 months the University of Oxford was racked with the problem of what to do with Miss Armstrong. And they eventually decided that the sanctity of the Oxford doctorate meant that I couldn't have the thesis re-examined. Otherwise everybody would want their thesis re-examined, and they would open the floodgates. So that was the end of my academic career. Then I became a school teacher, which I didn't like, but at least it was a job. At least I had an income and a little normality. And I learned a lot there. You're right, I learned how to speak there. One of the things that had been really distressing to me was that when I left the religious life, I was no longer able to respond spontaneously to literature. I found it impossible to discuss ideas. I had to find someone else to tell me what to think first before I could have an idea of my own. I couldn't have any ideas of my own. Shortly after I left the convent, my tutor said, just write a piece spend the week writing what you feel about this poem. And I couldn't do it unless I could read textbooks and create a beautiful academic exercise out of it. There was nothing in my head anymore. But when you're teaching and you are up in front of a room full of reluctant adolescents trying to teach them the value of the semicolon, you have to learn to make people listen to you, and I did learn that. But then I lost that job too because of my health, because I wasn't strong enough for it, and I was losing too much time off, and so that was terrifying. I had written my first book by that time, my first memoir about my time in the convent, and as a result of that, I got a job in television. And so I thought, well, here's something I can do, perhaps. I said this to Bill Moyers once, and he said, oh, in television we take anybody. And this was a great moment. This was a great moment because I was working. Nobody else would have touched this job with a barge pole. There was no money in this at all. We made the entire series for $100,000, 6 parts, which it sounded a lot of money to me then, but anybody will know who knows about television that would not make 10 minutes of a proper documentary film. But I went to Israel. I worked with an Israeli film crew on the life and teachings of St. Paul in Jerusalem, and there I encountered the other 2 monotheistic faiths, Judaism and Islam. And I realized then how parochial my religious vision had been up until then. I had never seen Judaism as anything but a kind of prelude to Christianity. And I'd never considered Islam at all. It was just not on my map. But in Jerusalem, where you have the 3 faiths jostling together uneasily at the same sites, you become aware of the profound connection between them. And I made other programs where I began to explore religion, but it was all very skeptical. By this time, I was sick to death of religion. It seemed to have done nothing for me at all. I was worn out with it. When I saw people reading a religious book on a train, for example, or a bus, I would be filled with disgust, never thinking that one day I'd be writing these books myself. And so my programs were very skeptical, rather, and indeed that suited secular London. The commissioning editor for religion at the at the new Channel 4, for whom I was working, would say, "Darling, this is all bonkers." And I agreed, and I felt that I had been liberated from thinking about religion, and I was going to sort of share my insights with everybody. But then my television career failed because the company with whom I was working embezzled most of the money for a project that I'd been working upon, and I was cast out yet again into outer darkness, tarred by this brush of disgrace there. And then, this was dreadful, but for the first time when that happened, I was upset. I allowed myself to be upset and angry, but mostly upset. Now, up until that time, when my thesis had failed and everyone was saying it was an injustice, I had been entirely kind of frozen about it. I'd not let myself feel anything, because I'd been taught all my life that it was slightly wrong to feel distress, that one should be above these things and grown up about these things, and, in the light of eternity, this was the great phrase, what did these ups and downs matter? But this time, largely because, too, by this time I was properly medicated, and my brain was working properly, and I felt that I was upset, and this was an advance. Friends tried to talk me through all this and tell me, to look on the bright side and everything would be fine. But it looked negative, but it was an advance. Because I now realize, though I didn't realize at the time, that this was the first step on the road to my coming back to religion. The Buddha said that the first truth that you have to absorb on the route to enlightenment is that life is suffering. That doesn't mean that you've always got to be gloomy and miserable, not at all, but that you must accept your own pain. If you deny your own pain, then it's very easy to dismiss the pain of others and to deny that other people are suffering. And you remain sort of locked in a sort of fool's paradise, but in a sort of permanent heartlessness. And my heart had begun to thaw. And once I'd started feeling my own pain, I found that when, for example, I turned on the television news and looked at the plight of these spectacles of suffering that assail us every night when we come home from work. Now it's Iraq, or the awful earthquake that's just happened in Turkey. At that time, it was the horror of Lebanon. And there were so many things going on. And I began to feel overwhelmed by other people's pain. I started to feel it. Up until that time, I'd looked at these newsreels or read the newspapers, and this suffering might have been happening on the outer reaches of the galaxy. But now, because I was feeling my own pain, I was beginning to be able to feel the pain of others, and that was an important thing. The next thing that unbeknownst to me was an important step forward to coming back to religion was my decision to write my book about God. I knew I'd got to find a new project. My television career was over. I had to find a new project because my entire life was hanging on a financial shoestring. I got to get some money from somewhere, and the only thing I seemed to be able to do was write, but write what? And one day when I was coming up the road, I lived in an obscure, miserable part of London at that time. It was all I could afford. With my 2 plastic bags full of groceries, the idea flashed into my head. why, instead of writing about the Crusades, which had been the doomed project that had finished my television career, which had been a very depressing project because it was exploring the hatred that had separated the three religions of Abraham from one another. Instead, why not do something more positive and look at something that all the faiths had in common? Why not write a history of the way they'd all seen God? Now, when I broached this subject, however, to my publishers and friends, they all thought this was a terrible idea. And said, oh, in London, no, don't do it. This is too religious, for heaven's sake. And why do it? You're not even religious. You never go to church. Why saddle yourself with all this discredited rubbish? But I felt that there was something there that I wanted to pursue, that I might not believe in God anymore. God had fallen away from me over the years, but there was something there that I wanted to pursue. But I expected it to be one of my skeptical books, which showed how people had manipulated the idea of God over time and to suit themselves. But I said, no, I'm going to do it, even though it was very hard for us to find a publisher. And I started. What I was doing was making up my own mind and walking away from what was expected of me. The religions tell you, again, you wouldn't necessarily know this because often, unfortunately, religious people are told always to conform. But at their best, the religions tell you you must take control of your own life. The Buddha used to say, never take anything at second hand. And very many of the leaders, think of Jesus, who was continually upsetting everybody and striding out on his own and doing the wrong thing, being with the wrong people, espousing the wrong ideas. At least that's the way he's presented in the Gospels as an iconoclast. In the mythology of the Holy Grail, there's a sentence in the old French version which says that if a knight goes into the forest and follows a path that's already been established, he will not have an adventure because he's simply following in somebody else's footsteps. He must go into the forest at a point that he himself has chosen and which nobody else has been before. So basically you must say, no, this is what I'm going to do, and that's what I had done. Now, I had no idea that this was a religious action, but I was about to find that if you behave in a certain way, in a different way, you change. That religion is not about believing things, it's about doing things that change you. It's a form of ethical alchemy. And I'd already discovered this, or at least this idea had been put to me by a Jewish scholar friend of mine, Chaim Maccabee, who had taken me out some years before when I'd wanted some advice about Judaism in the first century, and had told me the story of Rabbi Hillel, the older contemporary of Jesus, who had been approached by some pagans one day who told him that they would convert to Judaism if Hillel could recite the whole of the Torah while he stood on one leg. And Hillel stood on one leg and said, "Do not do unto others as you would not have done unto you." That is the Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. And that's a profound statement, and I've come to believe that that is the essence of the religious life. But at the time, this was astonishing to me, and I said to Chaim, well, what were these pagans supposed to believe? And Chaim said to me, "Easy to see you were brought up Christian." He said, "You know, we Jews, we don't hold so much by orthodoxy. Religion is about doing things, about behaving in a way that changes you." And I was beginning already, first in allowing myself to feel pain, secondly in branching out by myself to behave differently. And unbeknownst to me, that in itself was beginning to change me. Now, there I was, stuck in my funny little house in this grim part of London, which friends used to complain about it because it was so far off the beaten track. They used to say that they had to bring their passports when they came to see me. But so there I was, no longer engaged with a busy television project, endlessly having production meetings, endlessly chatting on the phone about the development of the project, endlessly doing my research one step ahead of the production team, because I knew nothing about any of this theology. I was learning on the job. Here I was, hour after hour, day after day, on my own, working in silence. Before, working in the highly secular television world with these people who thought religion was all bonkers, it was easy to ridicule religion. You'd find some sentence or other, or some doctrine or other, and you'd point out how irrational it was, and everyone would roar with laughter. And my own programs and my own work, because I wasn't an established scholar, had very much pushed me, Karen Armstrong, right to the forefront. The whole program, the whole books were dominated by a witty, bright, clever sort of person, sort of debunking this, being skeptical about that. But here I was, there was nobody to debunk anything to. I was living in silence, day after day, some week after week. Sometimes I would go for 3 days without talking to anybody, apart from a passing tradesman. And at first I resented this as part of the solitude into which I seemed to have been flung by the failure of my various careers. But gradually the silence began to change my attitude to the texts. Theology is a form of poetry, and you cannot read a sonnet at a party or a disco. And similarly, the poetry of theology needs what Wordsworth called a silent heart that watches and receives. And the silence became gradually for me a very friendly element, an element that started to change my attitude towards the texts. There was a quietness now in me and around me that enabled these words to go home to me, because I was now in that kind of state where I could begin to listen to the words instead of thinking what was the next clever thing that I was going to say about them, because there was nobody to say anything to. So my approach was starting to become less skeptical. And then I decided to write my biography of the Prophet Muhammad. This happened at the time of the crisis with Salman Rushdie, when the whole of literary London was in uproar. And I hated the fatwa and believed passionately that Rushdie must have the right to say whatever he chose. But I also was very uneasy by the way that only some, but a significant number of Rushdie's defenders in London defended free speech by attacking Islam. And I did not see that it could be right to defend a liberal position by promoting a bigotry, because I knew enough about Islam by this time to know that what they were saying was not accurate. And I knew, too, had a great feeling of dread, because with my new vulnerability to suffering, I could hear the pain of the Muslims who were trying to had been hurt by this book and who were hurt by the attacks in the press. And I was also aware, very much aware, that in Europe, at least, this kind of bigotry had resulted in the concentration camps, and we couldn't allow ourselves this any longer. And so I started writing my biography of Muhammad, and this time, because the matter was of great sensitivity, I, Karen Armstrong, had to go to the background. I could no longer be clever and witty about this. It was too serious, too dangerous almost. And again, I didn't realize this at the time, but again, the religions tell you that you cannot have a religious experience unless you put yourself on the back burner. And above all, to cut a long story short, I was beginning to learn through my studies, especially with my study of the Buddha, that the chief religious virtue is not belief, and it is compassion. All the great world religions insist that any religiosity, any real religiosity, must result in the practice of compassion. That doesn't mean feeling sorry for people, but it means feeling with others. And that the Buddha said that it was the practice of compassion that would introduce people to nirvana, which, or monotheists would say that it would bring them into the presence of God. And I've come to believe that we spend too much time sometimes worrying when we talk about transcendence, wondering about what we're transcending to, and worrying about the nature of God and does God exist. And if God doesn't exist, there's no point in living a religious life. And perhaps not enough thinking what we should transcend from. The egotism and hatred and dislike of others that keeps us from an experience of the divine. And that's where we come back to Hillel. And I honestly think that if we practice the golden rule, minute by minute, day by day, we would, first of all, not only not have time to worry about the existence of God or the proofs for the existence of God, etc., but we would also find ourselves that we were having intimations of transcendence and holiness. And that, I suppose that's the way for me now, I've come full circle. And I call my book The Spiral Staircase for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that I seem to have been going round and round and round, repeating the same mistakes, repeating the whole motif of failure in my life, until I came back to where I was at the beginning. I live alone. I've never married. I spend my days writing, thinking, and talking about God and spirituality. I'm a kind of nun. Again, in secular guise, perhaps, and having and finding that now my study is a kind of prayer, that I'm not particularly interested in belief, but I'm on a quest again, and a quest that I want to share with other people, but everyone is going to take the quest their own way. For me, the bliss of my life has proved, much to my astonishment, to be the study of theology. For other people, it will be a marriage, or a career, or a bringing up of children, or a ministry. But we have to find what is right for us, and it will take us eventually to the center of our lives. But my life seems to have come full circle, as T.S. Eliot said. T.S. Eliot has been, his poem Ash Wednesday has been of key importance to me. In another poem he says, you come back to where you began. And you come back to the beginning, but you see but you're never quite back at the beginning, because you see the place where you began from an entirely different angle. And I suppose that's where I've come to now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Armstrong has kindly agreed to take questions. Ivan Person has a microphone there. So if you will raise your hand, Ivan will find you with the microphone, and we will go on for a few minutes for questions. So maybe someone could bring the house lights up a little bit too, please. I wanted to start by saying you said that you always wanted to be a university professor. Well, it happens I've always wanted to be a successful author. If you want to switch, we have a question in the back.
Oh, could you tell us how you got involved in studying Buddhism?
Yes, quite simply, somebody invited me to contribute to the Penguin Lives series on the Buddha, but it was also in the family. My sister has been a Buddhist for 30 years, and I'd always, even from the time of A History of God, I'd been aware of the Buddha. Now, at the moment, in what's called the axial age, the period when all these religions came into being at much the same time. So I'm very much looking at the profound similarity that all these traditions have to one another. Well, I'm pretty loud.
Terrible accidents, sexual abuse of the child, incest, and others was never free. And this describes it because of the tremendous insight into Buddhism. The title of the book is The Gift of Suffering. Able to help all these and others, and she, I think, is a teacher as well as a psychologist, to survive and flourish. Unfortunately, I can't remember the author. In American New Jersey. If I can get in touch with you,
Thank you.
my library.
Thank you very much. We don't often think of suffering as a gift, and it's not anything that one enjoys at the time. But it can. It's hard though. But with help, that you can use it to good, and that's one of the great extraordinary abilities that human beings have, the ability to turn things around and not let them harden and fester and then become a source of evil. There's somebody up there.
I thank you for your speech tonight. It was just marvelous. Before I came, I said to my friend, I hope she isn't going to read out of a book. And I really appreciate what you said. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello, Karen. I'm
Hi.
very pleased to meet you. My name is Leila. I can relate to your story, the spiral staircase. I converted to Islam 5 years ago. I'd like to know what your general feeling is about Islam.
About
Islam.
Islam. Oh, heavens. My general feeling about Islam is that it is a very fine religion. In the age of faith, when the three faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam were all flourishing, Islam was the most adventurous of the three faiths. It had, and what first attracted me was its great pluralism. The Quran is a pluralistic document. It says that that God has revealed himself to every people on the face of the earth in their own language, in their own cultural tradition. Everyone has received a prophet from the past. The Quran praises the prophets, Jesus, Moses, Abraham, and tells Muslims that they are to say to these people who follow these prophets, we believe what you believe. Your God and our God is one. And this I found so inspiring. And again, the Sufi tradition appealed to me enormously. In particular, I'll just give you one hint at the richness of this tradition. One of my favorite Sufis is a 12th century Sufi called Ibn al-Arabi, who one of his wonderful statements was that God has spoken every single one of us in this room, every single one of the people who've been born in the world is a revelation to the world of one of God's hidden names. Every single human being is therefore a unique and irreplaceable revelation of the divine to the world. Now we can destroy that image in ourselves, but that is meant to be an exercise too, that if you look at all of us in this room even, and think how different we all are, and how each of us is a revelation, an incarnation of the divine to the world, then it becomes impossible to sum up God in a simplistic way. But also Ibn Arabi said that every one of us will only know that God that's been spoken in his or her being. So my God will be different from yours and yours and yours. And that each God will be, the words spoken in each of us, that is in the heart of each of our being, will be deeply affected by the faith tradition into which we are born. He wrote a poem in which he said that he was at home everywhere, in a synagogue, a mosque, a temple, or a church, because a man of God is not bound by any of these distinctions. And that our duty in life was to look at the unpromising exterior of the people around us and see that divine name, that divine spark within. And that's just one little glimpse of the riches of Islam. And that's what saddens me so much about what's happened recently, that this marvelous tradition has been, as it were, hijacked. And just as there are Christians too and Jews who've taken, who have become extremist and have turned the benevolent and inspiring nature of all these traditions and made them a force for violence and hatred. But Islam has all this and richness that speaks to one very profoundly, and that and the sad thing is that we have so much to learn from that kind of richness, all of us, and that most Western people, for all kinds of cultural reasons, have not known that alongside Judaism and Christianity, there's this third partner in the monotheism. I see monotheism as a religion that went three different ways. And I used to call myself a freelance monotheist because I draw sustenance from all three faiths and cannot see any one as superior to any of the others.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentation, also for your books. They're wonderfully helpful to many of us, and we're very appreciative, at least I am. Michael, you started to answer it a little bit. I guess the question is about what can we do about some of the divisiveness that gets sort of laid on religion. And you sort of started down that with a little bit of your answer just previously. Could you say a little bit more about what specific things from your experience, if you've watched religious communities, that we can do to strengthen the kind of directions that you're advocating?
I think education is important. I think that we live in a plural world, and the great gift of one of the great gifts of the 20th century was a more profound knowledge of other people's religions than had ever been possible before in human history. Now, some people find that threatening and have retreated into sort of new ghettos and erected new barriers against the other. Others find it inspiring. And I think first of all is to learn. Learn from each other. And I don't like the word tolerance anymore. I think we should scrub out the word tolerance. It sounds so kind of grudging in a way. Let's look at appreciation instead, because these traditions have not survived would not have survived without having the kind of richness that we all know exists in our own religious tradition, and which I've just been talking about, for example, in Islam. And let's learn to appreciate other people's traditions. And that means education, it means learning. There are all kinds of study groups, ever since, I must say, in the United States, alongside the conservative and backlash of intolerance, especially Islamophobia, since September the 11th. I've been inspired to see the way Americans have developed all over the United States, from sea to shining sea. A whole lot of interfaith groups and initiatives have developed, where people are beginning to study together, Jews, Christians and Muslims studying together, sharing their insights, getting to know one another, getting to visit one another's services, and teaching our children this. I think too, let's look at our textbooks, our school textbooks, see what they say of other faiths. For example, I grew up thinking of Judaism as a religion that was oppressive, and where the Jews were staggering under the appalling burden of the Torah, and this is and the Pharisees in the Gospels were seen as the word Pharisee, for example, has become a byword for hypocrisy, whereas the Pharisees were among the most advanced and enlightened Jews of Jesus' day. And so this kind of teaching that is often endemic in some textbooks and school books and the way we teach our children remain with you throughout your life. And most people don't have a chance to correct these insights because we're all too busy earning our living and running from day to day to start studying the history of Judaism. So I think we need to look at what we're teaching our children. We need to look at what we're teaching our children about Islam, and similarly, Jews and Muslims must also examine their own textbooks and see, because there are certain countries that teach where children are taught to hate and despise others, and this we cannot afford this anymore in our world. And the religions all speak of the importance of compassion. And I think if we all try to reclaim that legacy of compassion, Paul said, for example, you can have faith that moves mountains, but if you lack charity, it's worth nothing. And sometimes all we seem to be hearing is what we've got to believe, in the Christian world, or what sexual orientation we're supposed to have, and these are irrelevant matters. If we practiced compassion, everything else would fall into place. And I think that what the world needs is not more doctrines and not more assertions of sexual orthodoxy or certainty. It's compassion. It is to rescue the religious traditions from the divisiveness and hatred. That means we've got to study our traditions, study our scriptures from this perspective, and put compassion back into the center of our religious experience, rather than seeing it as a sort of a nice extra.
I'm afraid we only have time for one more question.
Hi, first of all, I just want to say that was a lovely presentation, and about 3 years ago was the first time I actually read your History of God, and that was my first time when I actually was on a quest for myself, because I'm actually from Pakistan, and I was born a Muslim. And where I come from, it's basically you're born into a certain religion, and you don't exactly really question it, and you just grow up on a certain path. And it was during my school times that I actually got a thesis to work on honor killing of girls and women, and that was the first time I actually started reading the Quran myself for the first time. And I also came across a lot of contradictions to it. For example, I don't quite personally agree with the law system of Islam. For example, having to chop off your hands if you commit a robbery, or having to stone to death infidels, and stuff like that. So, there were quite a few contradictions that I came across, and I was seriously studying Islam quite a bit at that time. And I don't know, at this point, the only thing that I didn't want to call myself a Muslim, actually, because all I can say is that I think I'm a Muslim by birth, but atheist by choice. So I just want to ask you, I'm 21 years old right now. I started reading a lot. I read a lot of your books that helped me out a great deal during that time period. And I read a bit of Salman Rushdie, and I read Tariq Ali, and quite a few of things like that. But somehow I could never see myself coming back to religion or coming back to Islam. So do you think it's a bit too soon to call, to just say that, yes, I am atheist? Or could you just suggest a few more readings for me?
This is one of the simple questions.
Listen, the important thing is to stay with what you really think. And all of us have those difficult things in our traditions. For example, the laws that you're talking about, we all have this in our tradition. We all have these cruelties and anomalies in our tradition, and they come from a time that was quite different from our own. And the point I would say to you, stay with what you really feel. stay with what you really feel. Do not tell yourself that you really want to be religious. If that is where you are, stay with it. Because I honestly think that what we call atheism, if it's a serious, thought-out position, is often a more, as I could say, religious attitude than a lazy, facile theism that just doesn't think about anything and is not disturbed, personally disturbed by things that are wrong. And so basically stay with it. Historically, the word atheism, now here I can go into more general things. The word atheism generally does not has never meant a blanket denial of the sacred or holiness or what we call God or nirvana per se. It's always a denial of a particular conception of God. At the beginning of their histories, Jews, Muslims, and Christians were all called atheists by their pagan contemporaries, not because they didn't believe in God, but because their idea of the sacred was so radically different from their contemporaries that it seemed blasphemous. This was a period of religious transition. And most of my friends in London are atheists. I was myself an atheist. And in Europe, I think this is understandable because the experience of Europe in the 20th century was so catastrophic, with 2 world wars fought on our own soil, with the Nazi Holocaust happening just a few hundred miles away, with a knowledge that whatever side of the war against Hitler we'd fought upon, we were all implicated in that catastrophe, and that the religions themselves were implicated in it. And this has made, for many people, faith impossible. And this is not a bad thing. You may have had some really bad theology given to you. And a lot of us are like that. A lot of us have been force-fed some really lazy theology that becomes just statements of orthodoxy. Theology should be poetry. When we make our theology, we should give as much attention to it as we do as if we were writing a great poem, not just churning out statements of this and statements of that. But there's not enough of that, and there's a lot of bad religion around. Not all religion is good. And sometimes in a restaurant, when you've been given a very strong tasting first course, they'll bring you a sorbet so that you can clean your mouth out and you can taste what comes next. Sometimes if we've had, and I think that's what has happened to many Europeans, that they've had so much bad theology, they need to rinse their minds from this. And maybe for a while, you may have to go into what people used to call the cloud of unknowing, or the dark night of the soul. And the cloud of unknowing means precisely that. It doesn't mean, oh, well, I will just pretend that I don't know that God is there. It means that you do not know that whether there's a God or not, or whether religion has any. You do not know. But stay in that place. The Greek Orthodox had a lovely image of Moses going up the mountain where there was cloud on top and being enveloped in great cloud. And even though you couldn't see anything, you were actually in the place where God is, but only if you're honest. So stay honest. Stay true to your insights. Don't become a secular fundamentalist. That often has as bigoted a view of religion as religious fundamentalists have of secularism. Keep your mind open, but stay where you are, and wait in the darkness and and be kind. Be kind to others and loving to others. And then I think you'll be living a good life. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. That was just very, very moving. I found your book that I'm 2/3 of the way through also very moving. And one of the, Chuck brought up the question of failures, and the only author I know who has, in this latest book, called her second book after leaving the convent a great failure herself, and in it she says she's glad that it was out of print. So that book, Chuck Ariam doesn't have to sell at the back of the room, but he does have copies of this latest, The Spiral Staircase. I just wanted to point out one or two things before I ask Dr. Michael Higgins, the president of St. Jerome's University, to thank our speaker tonight. One is that we have 2 lectures left in the St. Jerome Center lecture series. The next lecture is on March the 27th. Chris Burris, a psychologist, will address the topic, How Do I Hate Thee? And he says, well, we've moved, I guess, from the extremes from love to hate, but the he says we talk about hate a great deal, but do we know what hate actually is? And he has some fascinating research on that topic. And the last one will be on Friday, April the 2nd. Sister Miriam Martin will give a talk on women and worship. And many of you might remember that this was the talk that was supposed to happen last year on April the 2nd, or I think April the 3rd, and we had a freezing rainstorm that kept Sister Martin in Toronto. And the last thing I'd like to remember is to announce is on Friday, May 28th, retired Canadian Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, author of the best-selling Shake Hands with the Devil, The Failure of Humanity in Rwanda, will be speaking here at St. Jerome's, part of the Catholics in Public Life series that St. Jerome's University co-sponsors with the Waterloo Catholic District School Board. And that will be Friday, May 28th at 7:30 p.m. The next day, on Saturday, May 29th, there'll be a day-long workshop on Catholics in Public Life. If you want more information about that event, since this is something that is very quickly planned, we don't have it in our brochure. If you see Carol Person and give her your email address, she will make sure that you get all the information about General Dallaire's talk. The last thing I want to say here is that if you talk to Carol Person, you can also sign up to get the St. Jerome Center brochure. I've been working here for how many years? I can't get it right yet. St. Jerome Center brochure, and she will make sure that you get that this summer. And Karen, you told us that the Buddha's first noble truth is life is suffering. Here to prove the point is Michael Higgins to thank you on our behalf.
Please don't be alarmed. I have no intention of listing my failures. But I will list David's subjects. The Confessions of St. Augustine, the Pensées of Pascal, the Apologia of Newman, the Seven-Story Mountain of Thomas Merton, the Autobiography of G.K. Chesterton, Lewis is Surprised by Joy, Simone Weil's Waiting Upon God, Attente de Dieu, and Letters and Papers from Prison by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, all have in common one thing. They're part of a genre we call spiritual autobiography. It calls for a certain kind of maturity, that work, a certain kind of wisdom, a blessed transparency or luminous candor. It's not something that one generally writes at 17. I was thinking as Karen was talking about two of her contemporaries, the British novelist Antonia White, whose autobiographical tetralogy and her own subsequent work called, prose work called The Hound and the Falcon, deals with the complex involvement of psychology and emotion and spiritual questing and conversion and lapse and suffering with incredible poignancy. And Sheila Cassidy, a contemporary British physician, has done not unlike. We've heard it tonight. It's a form of peregrination, of going forth into strange places, like the knight that Karen referred to earlier from the Grail, going into the forest and going it alone. It takes a special kind of courage. Ignorance about religion in select political circles, among even some of the cognoscenti, and ever ubiquitous in the media, is an ignorance that is staggering. To do something to cast light on the dense darkness that envelops so much of the public discussion of religion, to dissipate the fog of hatred, to make the bellicosity of misguided religious rhetoric just a little less. These are not, believe me, the marks of failure. Thank you, Karen Armstrong, for bringing a little welcome warmth to this, our late February night. Thank you, Karen.
Then it is just up to me to thank you for resisting the temptation to see Mel Gibson's Passion of Christ, or as one critic called it, the Stations of the Cross. To join us here for an evening of enlightenment and spirituality, Karen has been so very generous with us all evening. Her last act of generosity is to agree to sign books. And as I mentioned, up here at the table, Chuck Arian has books at the back. I know many of you will be interested in that. So thank you all for coming, for your enthusiasm for the St. Jerome Center, and for a wonderful evening. Thank you.